In the early 1980s, illustrator Dave Stevens approached Pacific Comics with a pitch for a character based on the pulp adventure hero aesthetic from the 40s and 50s.
Stevens had come up in the industry working mainly on fan-created magazines and foreign printed material that was sold mainly in Europe and Japan. He was also a storyboard artist for Hanna-Barbera, working alongside illustrators like Doug Wildey, the creator of Johnny Test, and Alex Toth, the creator of Space Ghost, on television shows like Super Friends and the Godzilla Power Hour.
As I noted before, Stevens drew upon his love of classic pulp characters like Doc Savage and movie serial stars like Commando Cody, not to mention a certain renowned pinup model whom we'll explain a bit more on later, to tell the story of pilot Cliff Secord.
Secord and his mechanic friend Peavy, who was based on Doug Wildey, would happen across a newly developed experimental rocket jetpack. When Access sympathizers began searching around for the device, Secord donned both the jetpack and a helmet that Peavy designed to take them on as the Rocketeer.
Like many independent comics throughout the 1980s, the Rocketeer would wind up bouncing from publisher to publisher, still managing to gain quite a following, and eventually would get licensed by Disney for a movie adaptation.
The Rocketeer movie, starring Billy Campbell, Jennifer Connelly, Timothy Dalton, and Terry O'Quinn, also received critical acclaim, particularly from fans of the source material. Unfortunately, that acclaim didn't exactly translate to huge box office numbers, and plans for further films were abandoned, though there has been talk of a possible reboot or remake in recent years.
I actually did wind up seeing the movie in theaters, and I didn't really like it. At 10 years old, I just don't think it was quite the right age to properly appreciate the whole pulp movie serial aesthetic that the film was going for. And again, in the early 90s, I was just way too into things like early hip-hop and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles that just anything called the Rocketeer kind of felt inherently lame. Looking back at it now as a near 40-year-old, I can appreciate that the film is actually pretty decent, though there are a few effects that just don't really seem to hold up under HD viewing at all, do they?
The film did go on to gain a cult following and has even inspired an animated television series debuting in 2019, which follows Cliff Secord's great-granddaughter, Kit.
Dave Stevens passed away in 2008 while working with IDW Publishing on a remastered version of the original Rocketeer stories. And that's what we're looking at today, the original Rocketeer stories in The Rocketeer.
A high-speed car chase winds through the streets of 1938 Los Angeles. The escapees plow through the gate of a nearby airfield and try to take cover in a hangar. They decide to stuff their package in the pilot seats of a plane just before getting caught. The plane turns out to be the property of barnstorming stunt pilot Cliff Secord. Cliff finds the package and discovers it to be some type of government-funded rocket engine. The engine is designed to be worn by a human being and can propel the individual at speeds of around 200 miles an hour. Figuring he could use this for profit, Cliff calls his friend and mechanic Peavy to help construct a protective helmet for the device. Cliff's got big dreams to take his relationship with his girlfriend Betty to the next level, but it's going to take money as Betty is an up-and-coming actress and model who can't be seen with just a lowly pilot. Added to that, Betty has been working with a photographer named Marco who has a reputation for taking more than just a girl's picture.
Cliff's girlfriend Betty is based on Betty Page, the legendary pinup queen of the 40s and 50s. Though she had fallen into a combination of obscurity and self-seclusion, the Rocketeer actually played a major part in a renewed interest in Page that carried on past her passing in 2008. That was the tamest picture I could find.
As Peavy begins reluctantly working on the helmet, Cliff falls asleep. This results in him oversleeping and missing his spot in the next day's air show, where he's replaced by a pilot named Malcolm who has an alcohol problem. The plane begins smoking and flying out of control, and Cliff has no other choice but to rush back and grab the rocket pack along with the now completed helmet. Cliff blasts off and manages to catch up to Malcolm's plane, only to get thwomped by one of the wings. Cliff manages to recover and discovers that Malcolm has passed out and the controls are jammed. The plane is heading towards a nearby water tower, leaving Cliff no other choice but to grab Malcolm and fly to safety. While the press is having a field day, Betty shows up at the airfield and Peavy explains what happened, including the rocket pack, as the two rush off to the air show. It's there that Cliff has realized a bit of a problem. He doesn't know how to land. With no other choice, he manages to pilot himself into a stack of empty boxes, knocking himself out in the process.
So who exactly developed this rocket pack? Well, much like the movie, the comic insinuates that it was invented by none other than eccentric industrialist Howard Hughes, though the comic tends to paint Hughes more like a pulp adventure hero a la Doc Savage, a character you might remember from my review of this comic series Planetary.
Cliff comes to find a man pointing a gun in his face. The gunman knows people who are looking for the rocket pack and intends to bring Cliff in. The two barely miss running into Peavy and Betty, who find Cliff's bloody helmet near the boxes. Cliff is taken up to the Hollywood Hills, where the gunman soon realizes the two are being followed. It's not Peavy and Betty, though, as they get run off the road into a ravine. Instead, the perpetrators reveal themselves to be two German-speaking men who find the gunman and ID him as a federal agent. Cliff has been thrown from the wreckage and overhears the two men bring up Berlin. With no other choice, Cliff fires up the rocket pack and takes off through the spies. He runs out of fuel, though, and has to leg it back to the airfield where Peavy and Betty are waiting. As they patch up his wounds, both implore Cliff to contact the authorities, but Cliff is stubborn in seeing this through to the end, causing Betty to storm off. Cliff rushes off in pursuit and promises not to get himself killed. The next day, the Rocketeer, as the press has dubbed him, is all over the headlines. However, they also blame him for the death of the FBI agent. This appears to be enough to get Cliff to finally give up the rocket pack, though it's still going to need some repair before it can be turned over. Cliff leaves to deal with his boss for the air show, where he gets fired. While there, Peavy calls him about 3 suspicious individuals popping up at the hangar. Cliff books it back to the hangar to see the goons making off with Betty. Cliff takes off in his plane and dive bombs the bad guys, causing them to crash. Several onlookers come over to help the car, but then they find Betty in the back seat, causing the goons to run off. One of the goons gets nabbed by the feds, and he identifies Cliff Secord as having the rocket pack. The next day, Cliff tries to make plans with Betty, but she's got another photo session with Marco. Meanwhile, Peavy has figured out how to land the rocket pack by using a controlled descent. He's also added a gyroscope to help with balance. He and Cliff then go out to test it. When they're done, Cliff returns to the airfield to find 2 men waiting for him, one of them being a dapper gentleman and the other being a savage brute. The 2 represent the inventor of the rocket pack who'd like to have it returned. Cliff directs them to Peavy's, but gives them the slip while riding in the car with them. The 2 go on to what they believe to be Peavy's apartment and crash through the door. Only, this turns out to be Marco the photographer's apartment, and Betty's there au naturel.
Man, how long was she nude? I mean, when Cliff initially called her, it was morning, and it's now early evening in the comics, so yeah, this was going on for a while, wasn't it?
Both parties piece together what happened, and an irate Betty directs the 2 intruders to Peavy's real apartment. Cliff has already been there and made off with the rocket pack by the time the goons arrive, so Peavy is taken hostage and everyone returns to the airfield.
Also, we learn that Peavy's full name is Ambrose Peabody.
It turns out that Cliff actually stowed away in the car, but before anything can happen, a new experimental plane called the Locust is stolen by the Axis spies. Cliff intends to go after the plane, but is halted by none other than Doc Hughes. Peavy pleads with Cliff to turn the rocket pack over to its creator, but Cliff just fights free and takes off, leaving the upset creator behind. However, the rocket pack begins to lose fuel once more, and Cliff begins plummeting to the earth. However, Hughes manages to hop into his new plane, which I'm going to call the Cedar Gander, and manages to catch Cliff in time. The 2 men agree to work together to halt the bad guys, as Hughes pilots Cliff to the Locust, allowing the Rocketeer to get on the plane and open the door. He dispatches of one of the evil pilots and begins scuffling with the other as the plane begins to spiral out of control. Cliff finally drops the other pilot and tries to gain control for the plane, only for it to jam up. With no other choice, Cliff maneuvers the Locust into an uneasy landing on the streets of Beverly Hills. Cliff emerges from the wreckage, but soon collapses from his accumulated injuries. Cliff comes to in a military hospital where Peavy informs him that he impressed Hughes enough that he won't press charges on the rocket pack, but Cliff will still have to prove that he didn't kill the FBI agent from earlier. Peavy leaves the room if Cliff places a call to Betty. Except Betty isn't at her apartment. She's actually on a plane with Marco to New York City, where they will soon hop a ship to take a tour of Europe.
That seems like a really stupid thing to do in 1938.
Cliff starts to stage an escape, hoping to somehow get to New York City before Betty leaves. He just manages to make it to the lab with the now repeated and refueled rocket pack, and uses an explosion to avoid capture. Peavy, believing Cliff to be dead, is dropped off at his home, where he finds a note from Cliff informing him of his plan, and that Cliff took off in another plane.
Now, it's at this point we actually move on to the second Rocketeer miniseries, which is called Cliff's New York Adventure.
In New York City, Betty is having dinner with Marco and a few others, where she receives the news of the plane crash in Beverly Hills. As Betty leaves to collect herself, Marco talks to the scuzzy associates about his plans for Betty as well as several other girls. Meanwhile, Cliff makes it to New York City, or possibly New Jersey, where he meets up with an old running buddy named Goose McGee. The 2 hit up several night spots until they locate the one that Betty is supposed to be at. However, Cliff does not have the proper attire for the fancy restaurant, so he floors the maitre d' and puts his suit on instead. Cliff then confronts Betty to implore her to get back to Los Angeles, but Betty can't turn this down, still believing this to be a boost for her career. It's then that Marco intercedes and a fight then breaks out. The owner of the restaurant brings everything to a halt, and he tosses out Marco, for you see, he knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men, and he won't let the so-called photographer ruin another innocent young lady's life. The man introduces himself as Jonas as he and Betty get Cliff to the car, where Goose reveals that he actually knows Jonas. A possibly punch-drunk Cliff kicks Betty out of the car, wanting nothing to do with her, but Jonas assures her that everything will work out and Betty should really just go back to Los Angeles.
Obviously, Jonas is meant to be the Shadow, the legendary pulp character from the 30s and 40s. Now, due to rights reasons, they had to change his name, so he's not referred to as either Kent Dollard or Lamont Cranston. And if you want a deeper explorer of the Shadow's character, well, we'll probably save that for a later episode, okay?
The next day, Cliff prepares to return to Los Angeles even though he doesn't have enough money or gas for the return trip. It's then that Jonas pops up, and he has connections on the West Coast, so he knows about the rocket pack that Cliff is in possession of. He'd like Cliff's assistance with something, and he'll cover the cost for Cliff's return home. That night, Cliff heads down to a seedy dive bar located in the Bowery section of Manhattan. A stranger comes to his aid when a group of thugs try to jump Cliff, and that allows him to rocket to the top floor of the building. It's there that Jonas is waiting for him in an apartment. On the floor of the apartment is a smashed picture of a woman from Cliff's past named Tina. Jonas explains that he knows that over a decade ago, Cliff used to work for a circus sideshow as an assistant to a magician named Orsino. Over the past few weeks, every member of that sideshow except for Orsino and Cliff have been murdered, their spines snapped. The apartment belongs to the man behind those murders. His name is Lothar, and Cliff knows why he's after him. Cliff says they gotta get over to Atlantic City, as that's where Orsino is last known to be working. In fact, he's actually working that night, and he's called a volunteer from the audience, and that volunteer just happens to be Lothar.
Lothar is based on an actor named Rondo Hatton, who suffered from a late-onset form of acromegaly, resulting in many parts of his body, his face in particular, growing at an uncontrollable rate. Hatton starred in several films as a monstrous character called the Creeper before his untimely death in 1946. As for Lothar's past with Cliff, well,
Lothar was the strongman part of the sideshow, and he occasionally worked with Cliff and Orsino on a certain trick that involved Orsino breaking free of a straitjacket and freeing Cliff while he was trapped underwater. Tina was one of the little people on the sideshow, and she harbored a crush on Cliff, but he had eyes for a member of the knife-throwing act named Ruby. When Cliff wound up standing Tina up on a dinner date, Lothar comforted the diminutive lass, and the two began to grow close. The next day, Lothar arranged for Tina to replace Cliff when the latter overslept and missed his time to appear on the show. This meant that Tina was going to be doing the water tank trick with Orsino. She thought she could pull it off due to the fact that she had witnessed it so many times. Unfortunately, her size was too much of a detriment, and Tina ended up drowning. An enraged Lothar began attacking Cliff, killing another carny in the process, which resulted in him being sent to prison.
we now return to the present of 1938.
Lothar agreed to participate in the trick, which was a coffin-switching maneuver that makes an individual look mummified, but he then vowed to kill Orsino afterwards. When the trick was performed and the show ended, Lothar burst through the casket and took off after Orsino. It was then that Cliff arrived with Goose and provided enough of a distraction for Orsino to cut a rope that Lothar was climbing. The giant then fell through the boardwalk floor into the ocean below. Believing Lothar dead, Orsino treated Cliff and George to a night in the town to catch up on old memories. However, Lothar survived the fall and managed to stalk the trio and their dates onto a haunted boat ride. He pulled Cliff underwater and strangled him into unconsciousness. Believing Cliff dead, he abandoned the pilot and went after the others, setting fire to the ride along the way. However, Cliff survived and was carried outside by the water, and just as he came to, Jonas delivered the rocket pack and helmet via airdrop. Cliff took off to rescue his friends, but Lothar was still waiting for him. Orsino provided enough of a distraction to allow Cliff to fly the rocket pack up into the ceiling of the ride. Rather than allow Cliff to save him, Lothar continued to attempt to gain his revenge and eventually fell back into the fire. Orsino and the others managed to get to safety as the Rocketeer then flew off. The next day, Cliff packed his bags and said goodbye to Goose before leaving back to LA. However, Cliff has something, or should I say someone, waiting for him back at his favorite diner in Los Angeles. It's Betty. She's made a return. In her lingerie, apparently.
Happy ending, I guess? Well, I mean, that does conclude our look at the Rocketeer, and, well, on the plus side, I do see a lot of really good action sequences, some decent characterization throughout it, and I think the artwork is really top-notch. If there is a real drawback to this, it's that the second story arc, the Cliff's New York Adventure, is a little too plodding and slow-moving for my taste. It's just really kind of bogs everything down. Maybe that's because the first few actual Rocketeer chapters were backup stories in other comics. They were only about 8 pages long, but moving on to a full-size comic, everything starts to really slow down quite a bit. I mean, to be honest, I think it juggles too many plot threads, too. I mean, first Cliff is going in there to deal with Betty, but then he also has to deal with Lothar's return, and it's like, maybe have Betty, like, solve her problem on her own and move back to Los Angeles while Cliff's still in New York trying to find her. And then he re-encounters Lothar. Like, maybe that would have picked things up a little bit. But still, this is overall a pretty enjoyable read, and you can pick this up for dirt cheap on Comixology right now, either through the Unlimited program or the fact I believe it's still on sale for about $6 at this point. So if you pick it up, you'll get a decent read out of it. I'm going to give The Rocketeer a B. And with that, let's see what we'll be doing next time on the Random Trade Review.
Remember, you can help support my channel at patreon.com/sleepytimeforcatproductions. There, you can request a trade to be put in the randomizer, aka the cardboard box. Also, remember, like, comment, share, subscribe, and ring that notification bell.